Remember the Salafi tree at the beginning of the presentation? Unfortunately, Wahhabism has hijacked the legacies of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Ibn Taymiyyah. This is why so many Salafis are so sensitive about Ibn Abdul Wahhab. These Salafis are generally good Muslims who are yet to be red-pilled about the nature of Wahhabism. They don't really know the history of Ibn Abdul Wahhab and his true teachings because there's been a massive propaganda campaign to hide crucial facts about the history of Wahhabism. Today, Wahhabis hate to be called Wahhabis, but prior to the mid-20th century, Wahhabis had no problem calling themselves Wahhabis. For example, the leading Wahhabi scholar Sulaiman ibn Sihman wrote a work titled The Divine Gifts in the Defense of the Muhammadan Wahhabi Sect. But because of Wahhabi behavior, the Wahhabi brand had quickly become tarnished. Basically, from the time of Ibn Abdul Wahhab until the early 20th century, the wider Muslim Ummah considered Wahhabis to be Khariji deviants. This was a massive PR problem. This is actually acknowledged by Hussein ibn Ghanam. Ibn Ghanam is one of the most famous Wahhabi scholars. He was a contemporary of Ibn Abdul Wahhab and was a direct associate of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's sons. Ibn Ghanam wrote the earliest history of Wahhabism, which is known as Tarikh Najd, which we cited earlier in the presentation. Although Ibn Ghanam is a strong supporter of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, he acknowledges the fact that virtually all the scholars of the era had declared Ibn Abdul Wahhab to be a Khariji and a deviant outside of Ahlul Sunnah. Ibn Ghanam says, "The majority of scholars from various regions and eras asserted definitively that this individual, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, is among the most evil of the misguided, the impious, and the disbelievers, and one of the worst of the Kharijites and depraved people." So even the biggest supporters of Ibn Abdul Wahhab recognized how despised Ibn Abdul Wahhab really was. But things changed during the reign of Abdulaziz bin Abdurrahman as-Saud. He's widely known as Ibn Saud and the founder of the modern state of Saudi Arabia. In 1925, Ibn Saud conquered the Hijaz, which caused widespread opposition from the world's Muslims. The world's Muslims didn't want to see Mecca and Medina overrun by these Khariji Wahhabis. Ibn Saud responded to this backlash by denying that the Saudi state was a deviant Khariji government. Ibn Saud wanted to integrate with the rest of the Sunni world, so he had to start eliminating or downplaying many of the Khariji teachings of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Of course, the more hardcore Wahhabis didn't like these reforms, so they rebelled against Ibn Saud in the 1927 Ikhwan revolt. But Ibn Saud ultimately crushed this revolt and proceeded with his campaign to make Wahhabism more palatable to the Sunni masses. This is where Rashid Rida comes in. Rashid Rida was the famous student of Muhammad Abdu. Muhammad Abdu is the famous Muslim reformer who collaborated with the British colonial powers in the 19th century to modernize Islam in Egypt. Rashid Rida was Abdu's closest and most influential student. By the early 20th century, Rashid Rida became the most important figure in terms of publishing Islamic books. He published the reformist journal Al-Manar. He also printed and distributed many key Islamic texts. But then Rashid Rida made a monumental decision that would change the history of the Ummah. Rida formed a partnership with Ibn Saud to reform Wahhabi religious teachings. This reform meant that Wahhabis would start adopting certain ideas from Abdu and Rida. Now, why would Rashid Rida be interested in Wahhabism in the first place? To understand this, we first have to understand that Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida were modernists. As modernists, they wanted the Muslim world to catch up with Europe so that Muslims could progress, just like the Europeans had. So how could this happen? Well, they believed that what caused Europe to modernize was reforming Christianity. Christianity had a Protestant Reformation which eliminated the superstitions and backwards beliefs of the European Christians. By eliminating those superstitions, Christians could become rational and scientific, and this led to modernization of Europe. Muslim modernists like Abdu and Rida wanted to do the same thing for Islam. They wanted to modernize Islam by eliminating all superstitious and backwards beliefs and practices and basically turn Islam into a type of simplified, rationalistic Enlightenment deism. Abdu and Rida equated this new simplified rationalistic deism with what they considered to be Tawheed. This was their new definition of Tawheed. All other aspects of Islam were downplayed or eliminated. For example, Abdu famously claimed that there is no such thing as jinn, and anywhere that the Quran mentions jinn, it actually means microbes or germs. In this way, the superstitious belief in jinn is eliminated in favor of a scientific interpretation. Abdu and Rida wanted to similarly downplay or in some cases even eliminate doctrines involving angels, miracles, the supernatural power of Sufi awliya, magic, amulets, seeking barakah, and on and on. They considered all these Islamic doctrines to be associated with irrational, non-scientific superstitions. They considered these doctrines superstitious because they depart too greatly from a scientific, materialistic worldview. Now, this is where things get interesting. Abdu and Rida redefined the concept of shirk to include these non-scientific superstitions. If you believe in miraculous karamat of the pious awliya, that's not only irrational superstition, that's also shirk. So this is how Abdu and Rida not only redefined Tawheed, but they also redefined shirk. And they made it their mission to spread this so-called Tawheed, which is just a kind of rationalistic deism, and eliminate shirk, which they define as irrational superstition. But now Abdu and Rida face a huge problem. Pre-modern Islamic teachings do not teach this simplified rationalistic deism. Furthermore, there are many Islamic texts which legitimate amulets, seeking barakah, interactions with jinn, interactions with angels, interactions with the dead, belief in the supernatural power of Sufi awliya, belief in the reality of magic, and on and on. All of this is not only acknowledged and endorsed in the Islamic tradition, it's even endorsed by figures like Imam Ahmad and Ibn Taymiyyah. As we saw earlier, Imam Ahmad and Ibn Taymiyyah endorsed things like calling to angels and jinn. They also endorse seeking barakah and even the use of certain types of Quranic amulets. So this becomes a huge problem for Abdu and Rida, who consider these things to all be irrational superstitions and shirk. But Rida found a solution for this. He appealed to the teachings of Ibn Abdul Wahhab from almost 200 years before him. Rida finds in Ibn Abdul Wahhab a pre-modern figure who goes against Imam Ahmad and Ibn Taymiyyah in calling all of these things shirk. This is great news for Rashid Rida. The only problem is Wahhabism has such a bad reputation. So to solve this, Rida rebrands Wahhabism as Salafism. The term Salafism was coined by Rashid Rida in the 20th century. A lot of Salafis don't know this fact because it's been repressed for the simple reason that Rashid Rida is a known reformist modernist. In any case, Rashid Rida developed a strong relationship with the early 20th century Saudi government, which had just taken control of the Hijaz. Rida used his journal Al-Manar and other publications to launch an international propaganda campaign to convince the Muslims of the world that Wahhabism was actually not a deviant Khariji doctrine and that everything they had heard about Ibn Abdul Wahhab was false. Meanwhile, Rida sent many of his students to advise on the reform of religious and educational institutions within Saudi Arabia itself. For example, students like Taqiyuddin al-Hilali, and members associated with the Egyptian organization Ansar as-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyah. Since this time, Saudi has aggressively promoted reformed Wahhabism around the world under the title of Salafism. But unfortunately, this is the reality. The good news is Salafism can be purified of these elements. We can cut off the rotten branch from the Salafi tree.